I'd love to create something to where maybe I could put like a little node on you or something like that, and it would be like a heat sensor. And I could see where you walk and spend most of your time in a classroom. Because like if we could actually monitor where we spend most of our time in a classroom, like is it at the front of the board, or do we always go and talk to that gifted student because those conversations are a little bit easier? It would be really interesting, if we could just find a way that we could just heat map the space and where
that
we
there
spend
is
time
the
in a classroom.
one and only G. Fletcher himself. Yes, today on the podcast, we have ThreeAct Math Task Builder, national speaker, and math specialist, Graham Fletcher.
Stick around while we chat with our good old Canadian friend who's transplanted himself in America on what it really means to assess, how to leverage engagement in your math class, where do some teachers miss the mark when teaching through tasks, why tasks are great formative assessments rather than summative assessments, and how to view your lesson from 60,000 feet instead of 6 inches. Here we go. Let's do it.
Hit it! Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce from tapintoteenminds.com.
And I'm John Orr from mrorr-isageek.com. We are two math teachers who, together,
with you, the community of educators worldwide who want to build and deliver math lessons that spark engagement,
fuel learning,
and ignite teacher action. John, are you ready to talk with our dear friend, Mr. Graham Fletcher?
Of course, Kyle. Of course. We are pretty pumped to have one of our good buddies on the show today to chat about ThreeAct tasks, assessment, and even coaching. We met Graham kind of like, Kyle, how you and I met online through Twitter. And while meeting up at conferences across North America, we became pretty good buddies. We'll even chat a little about that in the episode.
Yeah, you're right, John. It was great finally getting a chance to meet another person that we've been collaborating with and connecting with on Twitter for such a long time. So it's great that we can now call Graham a good friend and someone that we can turn to for advice. Before we get into this, though, have you shared some of your feedback on iTunes yet? Take a moment, tap that subscribe button, and spend a minute letting us know how you're enjoying the show, just like S. Hershey 0303, who must be our dear math moment maker from the Academy, Mr. Sean Hershey. I can't imagine it being anyone else. Here's what his review says.
Down to earth and practical strategies to implement right away. Kyle and John are two passionate educators who can relate to our struggles and are willing to tackle tough issues head on with practical advice. They offer actionable steps to help with topics such as, but not limited to, classroom management, concept-based lessons, mathematical practices, managing your time, engagement, selecting technology, etc. This is a very worthwhile and beneficial podcast for any educator looking to enhance their pedagogy and deepen their understanding of mathematics.
Wow, thanks so much to Sean for posting this review and subscribing. And did you know that we actually have more reviews on the US iTunes Store than on the Canadian iTunes Store? Come on, Canada, we live in Canada. Send us some love by giving us a review and subscribe now.
Before we get to our discussion with Graham, we want to let you know that the Make Math Moments Academy, your home for ongoing support in implementing problem-based lessons, amping up your pedagogical moves, and stretching your math content knowledge, is open. And the Make Math Moments Academy community is waiting to welcome you in.
You can decide if the Academy is right for you over at makemathmoments.com/academy.
That's makemathmoments.com/academy.
Well, let's get on to the conversation with G. Fletcher.
Hey there, Graham. Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. We are super excited to get you on the show today. We've been trying for a bit now and pumped to talk to you finally here. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I know we Tried and it failed the first time, but glad to finally circle back around. It's always fun getting to hang out with you and Kyle and just kind of chat about math and just other things as well on the way. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic, Graham. We are super excited every time we bump into you at conferences. The last time, I believe, for us was NCTM, just a month or two ago. We had an opportunity to dive into some really cool conversations. So hopefully we'll be able to bring some of those to the table here today. But before we do, can you fill in the Math Moment Maker audience on your role, where you're located, and maybe a little bit about what got you into this teaching gig?
Yeah, so right now my current role is I'm not with a district. I've kind of taken a choice to kind of do some work on the side, I guess, which has really allowed me an opportunity. It's strictly selfish, to be honest. My wife and I, we both have daughters. We have a daughter going into grade 7 and a daughter going into 4th grade. And so what I've done is I've kind of stepped away from a district here for the past, I just finished my 2nd year. And it's really allowed me to spend a little bit more time at home with my daughters, but then also go out and support certain districts kind of all over the place as well. And so that's kind of where I am right now, but very much like you and with John as well, I'm sure the journey is a long one. It's a fun one. And then just kind of thinking about that growth over the years has kind of brought me to this place now where family comes first. So that's kind of where my brain is. And then math obviously comes second for sure.
I would love that opportunity to spend more time with my kids. That sounds quite amazing. Graham, do you mind filling us in a little bit of a backstory? I know there are a lot of fans of yours listening right now, and I think they would love to hear about how you got into teaching from the start. You've told us where you ended up right now, but where did you begin this kind of journey?
The journey began back home in Canada, and then I ended up in the States on a soccer scholarship, and I ended up getting a business management degree. And I went back home, worked in Milton, Ontario for a little while, and it just wasn't kind of working out for me. But in the meantime, I stuck together my then at the time girlfriend, who is now my wife. She was going through school at the same time, and she became a teacher, and I was doing a lot of coaching soccer back home in Canada, but then also in the United States as well. And just that love of being around kids and showing them something new or showing them a new move and then allowing them to take that and then practice it and come back and then be able to kind of perfect it and then put it in a game situation is something that I really, truly loved. And I guess the best way to make a career out of that, if you're not coaching, is teaching. Because I think that's what we do. We can't jump on the soccer field and go play the game or kick the ball for these kids. And so for me, it was setting those kids up in a classroom. So I actually chose teaching as a second career after sales for about 2 or 3 years. And then I traveled down to Damon. I actually was still living just outside Toronto, traveled to Damon College in Amherst, got my teaching certificate, and then moved to the United States. And the rest is history. And now I'm married to my wife, who is a kindergarten and first grade teacher. And so that's kind of the journey where I am right now. Yeah, that pretty much sums that part of it up.
I love the connection going back that you started as a coach. And I find we can learn a lot from coaching in sports. And, in the math classroom especially, even though I did some coaching, I never made the connection that when I coached students, you always gave much more specific and differentiated advice to your players because you're watching the game, you're analyzing them playing, you make your practices and you adjust your practices based on how your team is performing. And it seems like so obvious now that I should have been doing those things in my classroom as well. However, in my classroom, I was doing something completely different. I wasn't really watching them play the game because I didn't really give them much time early in my career to actually play in front of me. I was like, go play the game and I'm going to skip it. And what I mean by that is I'm going to send you home and you're going to do homework. I'm not going to be there to actually observe the game. And then you're going to come back tomorrow and I'm going to run another practice without actually knowing how well you perform. So I don't know if you can see that piece where if coaching had some sort of influence on your teaching, at least maybe early on, or was it later? For me, I totally missed the mark until later on. What was that like for you?
So at first it was a struggle, right? Because you're trying to basically, as a teacher, kind of force kids to do things that they might not be able to, but that's also part of the learning curve. So to go back to that coaching analogy on say a soccer field, coaches, athletic coaches always try to put their players in the best position they can be to succeed. So for instance, if you're not a very fast player, a coach wouldn't put you out on the wing. And so it was after quite a few years in a classroom to where I realized I kept putting those students out on a wing And that might not be where they will thrive. Maybe they thrive in a different position, which is that differentiation connection. So the only thing I can really say is that I really missed the boat my first couple of years of teaching. But then what's happened is over time, I've really realized to see like, hey, what connects with kids? What doesn't connect with kids? How can I, as my capacity builds as a teacher, it's kind of like the more that I'm able to connect and ask that purposeful question to move student thinking forward.
I'm going to extend this a little bit further because I resonated with this metaphor that when you said you would help a kid, you would show a kid a skill, and then you would have them practice that skill, and then they go and perform that skill. And I remember distinctly, that's the way I viewed math class too. I even said that this is what we do to students. Like I would tell students that exact formula. Kids would say like, why are we learning math? And I would say, well, you're learning math mostly because you're training your brain to think a certain way, which is, I think we all try to say that to our students. But I would say specifically that, math is the only subject where we're training you to like think about a skill or learn a new skill and then apply your learning to that skill and solve a problem with that skill. Like you're going to do that for the rest of your life. In any job you get, you're going to have to learn new things and apply those things. But I was very literal in that with the students. I would say, I'm going to show you how to do these skills exactly, and then you're going to apply those skills onward. So I've changed my tune a little bit in the sense that I'm not showing my player exactly how to do exactly every skill. We're exploring the skills a little bit more before showing them exactly how to do it. So I definitely agreed with you how you approached teaching or approached coaching and into teaching. I set it up very similarly, but I think I'm taking a little different path since then.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of the times, like just because you're a really good teacher in a classroom might not necessarily make you a really good coach. There's a whole lot of different things that kind of play into that. Maybe you're a really good coach of teachers, or maybe you're a really good coach of students. Like I look at Michael Jordan as a prime example, like best player of all time. When he tried to become a coach of the Washington Wizards, it didn't go out so well. So even though you know the math or you do the math, there's a whole much more of nurturing and really just listening to students and doing what's in their best interest to move their thinking forward. So I couldn't agree more.
We've mentioned this many times, just this idea of like, if you felt that math sort of felt natural, I never want to say it is natural, like you're just born with it or anything like that, but it's like the experiences you had in your life led you to feel as confident in math and you didn't really feel that struggle. The same as in coaching, where as a hockey fan, I remember when Wayne Gretzky was coaching, then I think it was the Phoenix Coyotes, and, really struggled. And I really think it has a lot to do with this idea of not actually understanding how everybody else plays the game, right? It just feels so natural because he was so young when he started to play. That sort of resonates with me when I think about especially secondary math teachers. John and I being high school or former high school teachers, I come out of the classroom thinking like, I didn't really experience the same struggle that a lot of other students did. So it's really hard for us to try to figure out how we're going to help them get through.
And I think that's a really super important part. I think that's something that I know I've worked really hard to do, and you have, and many teachers have, right? Like it's not something that you can ever be complacent in because kids are always changing. So what are we doing to continue to evolve as teachers that we continue to meet the needs of those kids as they continue to change and evolve? So yeah, I think that's a great point, Kyle, for sure.
Yeah, and we can dive into that a little bit later. But before we get into all that, we have to ask you the question we ask every guest, and that is about your memorable math moment from math class. So when you think of math class back as a student, it also could be as a teacher. Many people do give teacher or student kind of memories. If I say the word math class, what has just popped into your mind, Graham, to remember about math class?
For me, it's working with kindergarten students. There's one particular story that really resonates with me, and I've actually shared it in quite a few conferences. And one of the things that I love about kindergarten class is that student intuition lives. Like they're so vibrant in that classroom, and they're not tainted with rules that many parents teach, teachers teach. Lots of rules, rules, rules. So I was playing around in a kindergarten classroom, and I ran into this little guy, Mac, and he was actually trying to add up all of these different colors of candies. And so as he was adding up all the candies, he drew the pictures out, and there was actually 2 white candies, but he didn't draw the boxes. So he was able to actually image those candies. So if you were to count what's on the paper, you would count 8 pieces of candy. But because I was listening to Mac, I was able to see that there were 10 pieces of candy because he actually imaged the last 2. And so that really hit a note with me. And it's funny that you asked that question because that story happened, I don't know, maybe 3, 4 years ago, but it was maybe about 2 months ago now that I heard on Twitter that the Latin root word for assess, it means to sit beside. So like I wonder like how many times do we truly think that we're assessing what a kid knows if we're not sitting beside him? And so when it comes back to that Mac story, I wouldn't have been able to truly assess what was happening on his paper. I would have seen 8 and just said, "Yep, it's done." But because I sat next to him, it was affirmation that I have to do everything I can to continue to sit down next to students so I can hear their thinking because it's so beautiful. And who are we to kind of guess what's coming out of the mind of a 5, 6, or 7-year-old?
I was going to add, like that's been a realization for me for the last few years also, in the sense that how many times in my past teaching life did I sit down next to students just to listen to how they approach problems or how they shared their thinking. And even when I started to change my teaching style to be a little bit more like that and a little bit more open in how I presented or assessed my students, I still probably didn't make a point to sit down with everybody at some point, and I think there was a semester that went by that at the end of the semester, I realized like, you know what, I don't think I ever sat next to that student or listened to that student. I only marked their papers or I only marked their quizzes. Like I never got over to their desk to hear them or to their wall space. And I thought, you know what, I'm never going to do that again. And at that point, one of my tools was to create a chart to make sure that I could hit everybody in a certain time frame. So that's huge for us to think of. And I'm really glad you brought up how the Latin root for assess is to sit beside. I think that's huge.
As you're talking about that, John, and it's something that's been in my brain for quite some time, and I'll kind of share this, and then maybe the people that are listening to the podcast, they can maybe chime in here. But like, I'd love to create something to where maybe I could put like a little node on you or something like that, and it would be like a heat sensor, and I could see where you walk and spend most of your time in a classroom. Because like if we could actually monitor where we spend most of our time in a classroom, like is it at the front of the board or do we always go and talk to that gifted student because those conversations are a little bit easier? It would be really interesting, if we could just find a way that we could just heat map the space and where we spend time in a classroom would tell us a lot about our effectiveness as a teacher, I think.
Yeah, this brings up an interesting study I heard a while back, and I don't know, it was, I think when I was in university or a teacher's college, and it goes to the idea about that we flock, I think, as teachers to good feedback. Like when you are teaching a lesson, you're, I think, naturally drawn to the kids that are nodding their heads or asking questions. Like you kind of want to go that route. It's harder to go to the other kids that are not engaging in that way. And it brings up this study that I heard they did a test on a professor at university, and when the professor went to the left side of the room, like he would pace back and forth around the front of the room. When he would go to the left side of the room, all the students in the room were directed to not look at him. And so then when he went to the right side of the room, they would look at him and nod their heads and it looked like they were paying attention. And so then over the course of like the hour lesson, and what happened was progressively, they would make sure that the farther he went right, the more he'd look at them. And eventually this guy ended up like in the side aisle because he was realizing everyone was watching him only when he was on the right side. So he just spent all his time over there and never ever went back to even the middle of the room. He was directed to go over there just from the feedback he was receiving from the audience.
It's funny because as Graham, you were mentioning this idea of the heat sensor, and I've seen some people do this on Twitter quite a bit where let's say they've made a change in their classroom. And I'm thinking of Chris Lee in particular. I wish I knew his Twitter handle off the top of my head, but we'll include it in the show notes. But he had shared a time-lapse video of how his class sort of looks now versus what it used to look like. And it was really cool to see it because, you see the 60-minute or 75-minute or whatever the time frame class, and you see the kids are up and they're at the whiteboards and, he's moving around the class and he's all over the place in comparison to he's sort of, I don't know whether it was an actual video from a couple years ago or whether they were just sort of imitating the way he used to teach where he would just sort of stand and deliver at the front. And I think it's something for us to all be thinking about because like something I'm noticing now that I'm actually aware of how important it is to sit and listen to students, I still struggle, even though I'm next to them and listening. Sometimes it's like I'm in my own brain thinking of the question I want to ask the student next that I haven't even heard what they were saying. So like even just to sit beside them is obviously a step in the right direction, but then it's like a whole new skill to develop, especially if, you've been teaching your whole career not doing that, to actually go and actually become an active listener and actually listen to what the student's saying, and then essentially on the fly try to connect what they're saying to like whatever solution strategies that you have anticipated ahead of time. And then it's obviously extra work if it's a solution strategy that you've never seen before, like the example of Mac in the kindergarten class, where you probably would have assumed he was just wrong because it was only 8 candies on the page, but whether it was with his finger that he motioned the other 2 white candies or whatever it was, you were there to actually pick up on that, and obviously to really show him that you were listening to him and that he was being heard. So such a cool point.
Yeah, it's those moments, right, that make it all worthwhile for us. When we see kids that flourish, or that light bulb moment, I think that's what every one of us wake up so early and we put in the extra hours to do the things that we do. I think that's it. We just want to see kids succeed.
I want to ask you some questions about some of your teaching experience. I've always been curious. What's an example of a classroom experience you had where you had some success, and what did that look like?
In a classroom, I think it's when, I don't know if there's like one pinpoint story that I could actually nail down, and I think it would be more of an evolution kind of in terms of my teaching, to where I've seen success. There might be little snapshots and little moments that happen over time, but it's hard to pinpoint any one of those. I think the biggest thing for me is what I've realized is I was surrounded by some really great people. So I was a third grade teacher for 8 years. And then I had a math coach, and his name was Mike Wernicke. He now works at our state department, but then there was also our math coordinator, Turtle Toms. And so one of the things that they did was they kind of brought me in as a coach to that community. And then as I was kind of working in classrooms and things like that, being able to empower teachers or being able to work with kids and push their thinking forward. But the biggest struggle is just letting go and trusting the process. And so once I've actually been able to put a good task and realize that, hey, it's okay that if this kid doesn't get the right answer today, well, if I'm using it as formative and summative, if I'm using it as formative and diagnostic assessment, then it doesn't really matter. Right answers only really matter when it's summative. So I think me kind of relinquishing some of that control to know that, hey, it's okay if kids struggle and they don't get the right answer, because we're building up to something better. So for me, I guess it's not one single moment, but I would say in terms of my journey, that's probably the thing that I'm most proud of, is that ability to kind of relinquish that control.
I'm so happy that you shared that, because when we were chatting a few months back, I remember asking you that question of what sort of got you on the path to thinking differently about math class. And I remember you mentioning both Mike and Turtle. And I think how awesome for those coaches to be able to kind of look back, and obviously they must realize that they've impacted not only you, but probably countless other educators. And then just thinking about how many students that's actually impacted, it's so huge. And clearly, like, I love the idea that you're sharing with us about trusting the system. And I came out of my classroom after so long thinking like, today I was supposed to get through this. And, if students didn't get that, it was sort of like, I don't know what else to do. But when you think about math differently, and you think about every single day as this opportunity to hear about what kids are thinking and then to essentially respond to it, just like a coach would, at practice, where, just because we did one-timers, in hockey in the first couple practices of the season, it doesn't mean we're not going to come back to one-timers if the team's not able to use them in a game situation. You've got to come back to these things. So, what I'm hearing is like that the math class is like a dynamic space. It's not supposed to be static. It's not supposed to be 100% scripted, even though planning is so important. But just knowing that the plan is there to guide you, and then it's making those pivots, right? And being okay and comfortable with pivoting, I think is so important. So I really think that's awesome how you've articulated that in that last comment.
One of the struggles that we kind of go through, like, we have so many resources that are kind of pushed on us. So I think it comes back to us, to how do we be wise consumers? we kind of have to vet the things that we're putting in front of our students. And then what struggles, like whether you're a coach or whether you're a teacher, like maybe you're the only person in your building and you need somebody to bounce ideas off of. I love the fact that the three of us met through Twitter. So now, like we've stayed in touch and stayed connected over the years, but maybe Twitter's not your jam. But how is it that you can find somebody that's kind of like your math soul buddy to where you can kind of meet with them, knock on ideas? Because when you do that, then that's only going to make you better. And then so like if you have an idea, I think the whole story of having Mike and Turtle for me, there was also a whole group of coaches. There was maybe about 5 or 6 of us, many of teachers who are still active in the math Twitter blogosphere as well. So it's like surrounding yourself around people that are go-getters and people that want to aspire to do the best for kids, even when it's sometimes the most difficult decision at the end of the day to make.
Right. And so important, definitely, to have someone to share that with, and being so awesome in today's age that you can do that through Twitter, but it could be on Facebook, but it could be through email. It could be lots of different ways. It doesn't have to be just in your own department. And I think that's why I think our support groups are so big and so useful. And we've probably grown so fast, as educators in the last few years, just because we've shared through Twitter and met up online. Like you said, we met through Twitter originally, and then through conferences. Same with Kyle and I. Like Kyle and I, even though we live down the road from each other, we didn't meet until online space, and then supported each other for a number of years after that.
I also think that's a testament to the work that you and Kyle are doing as well. Just setting up communities where teachers, like, when they need somebody. There's a lot of rural places across the United States and Canada and the world. And what you guys are doing is you're providing that platform to where, hey, maybe you don't have somebody in your building that's your math soulmate. Well, maybe you can find somebody through you all. So I've always appreciated the work that the two of you are doing to kind of breed and then kind of help that and foster just that community aspect of our mathematics community.
Definitely. I think that's one of our main goals, especially with this podcast, is providing professional development and support for teachers wherever you are, and also like whenever you want. I think that's key too. And it's definitely a different time. Like I would never have imagined when I first became a teacher that I would be doing this right here, but also listening to podcasts on my drives during my time off. Like it's definitely a different world because of the opportunities we have. Let's start moving into talking about some ThreeAct math stuff, because I think that's something that all three of us have been really advocates of, from Dan Meyer's work with the math task structure. One thing that I've always been curious about, and stuff that Kyle and I have been working on and thinking about and sharing, is about the lasting power of ThreeAct math tasks. Like, for example, I think most people are drawn to ThreeAct math tasks themselves because of the visual elements to engage students. But I think and we know that there's so much more to that structure and how you handle that, just engaging kids in math. In your opinion, what is it about the structure itself that's much more than just engagement?
I think it's the whole open middle aspect of the task. So I'll be honest, just my own little journey here with ThreeAct tasks. When I first started doing them, I was really like just super engaged, super pumped up right alongside the kids. Like we're both high-fiving, we're clapping. And then it's like, 45 minutes, an hour passes by. I'm jacked up. The kids are jacked up. Everybody's had a great time in math class. And then after doing that 3 or 4 more times, something clicked. And I said, you know what? Kids are never engaged in school. And here they are, they're engaged for whether it be 50 minutes. What am I doing with that engagement? And what I realized is, as much as I was super pumped up that kids were engaged, I wasn't leveraging that time to really learn what the kids were doing, because they were so willing to talk. They were so willing to share, because just the structure of a ThreeAct task, what it does is, and both of you know, it really makes it really accessible to every kid in your class. Every single kid in your class can make an estimate. No matter what labels the school system has put on you, every single kid can make an estimate. And that's that buy-in. So my big journey was doing the task, but then also now understanding, like, what are we doing to use this not as an engagement tool necessarily, but more as that formative and diagnostic assessment.
That sounds exactly like our journey. And I know so many other people who experience the same, like you're hooked. Like, how could you not be? The kids are hooked, you're hooked, everybody's having a blast. But at the end of the day, I realized afterwards that the way you start to frame the questions and the way you start to really, like John and I like to coin it as sparking curiosity, you start to realize that while the visual element is so important, it's so helpful for so many students to make sure that we're making sure that floor is low enough, you start to realize that every single day doesn't necessarily have to be a video in order to accomplish some of those things. But it's like those elements, like you were saying, like getting them curious, and it can happen in so many different ways. Now I realize it's like if I focus in on the pieces, the parts that really help kids sort of want to just jump in and dive in and take a chance. If we really focus on those things, those kids will have some success. Now, our next question we have is, in your opinion, and I feel like you were hinting at it just a little bit, you had said like, what was I doing with all of that engagement? And we're wondering, where do you think teachers can easily miss the mark when we use ThreeAct math tasks or anything along those lines where we're really trying to get kids to lean in? Where do you feel like sometimes we can come short if we just sort of get wrapped up in the engagement and really don't think much further beyond that?
I think it's where we purposefully and intentionally use the task. For instance, I think many of us, I'm guilty of this. We might use something like Problem Solving Friday, where we'll use a ThreeAct task on a Friday. And what that does is it kind of sends a message that, hey, we only do problem solving on Friday. Or you save your ThreeAct task for the end of the unit. Well, by then, what's ended up happening is all the students have kind of tiered and ranked themselves, whether we agree with it or not. And then it's summative. And summative assessment, if we save it for the end of the unit, summative assessment is the autopsy, right? Like the learning's done, the learning's dead, it's over. There's no more learning that's going to be taking place if we save it for the end of a unit. So what would happen if we take that really good task when the kids are going to be engaged, when they're going to be enthusiastic about coming into class, and putting it at the beginning part of a unit, or maybe 2 to 3 weeks into a unit, to where now the playing field is still level and everybody now has a common voice because it's new learning for everybody in the classroom, to where now students, there's that equity piece where certain students have access to certain content, but like a good problem like this, a good problem like a ThreeAct task, nobody has the answer. And so your students that always want to jump in and just get the numbers and steamroll forward, well, the task will slow them down. And then the other students, some of our most thoughtful students, who are some of our more meticulous students who think a little bit slower, we've actually allowed them to engage in the conversation now. So I think where we use these tasks is where we kind of miss the mark a lot. We use them formative, like most of the time as summative, but I think it's diagnostic and formative is where we need to be spending most of our time with these.
We couldn't agree more. Oftentimes, that's the number one email we get, and I'm sure you get many of these emails too, where someone replies through your blog or through a task and says, I tried this task and, it just didn't go well. Like it flopped, or the kids didn't want to notice or wonder. And like some of that is building the culture, of course. Like you have to really build the culture with your students so that they feel comfortable to share what they're thinking and to not feel like there's just one right answer right from the get-go. But then oftentimes what we get down to, we ask them, where are they using the tasks to kind of paint us a picture of the current unit of study. And oftentimes they do say, we did it at the end of the unit. And John and I often reference that, and we call that the rush to the algorithm, right? So it's like, I'm going to feed you stuff for 4 days, and then all of a sudden, now I'm going to give you this task. Kids know, obviously, all this stuff you just pre-taught me is probably what I need to do for this task. So not only does it kill the curiosity, but it also kind of pigeonholes me into a spot where I'm not actually being asked to problem solve. I'm being asked to regurgitate, right? Steps and procedures. So I love that idea of kind of flipping it and using it to introduce ideas. And early in that response, you had mentioned purposefully and intentionally. And that's a part where we admit wholeheartedly for the very long time, like we were doing this and we were just happy that it looked like our kids were alive in our class, right? We coming from the secondary side, we were like, man, they're alive. Like they're not dead on their desks. That's amazing. And we went with that because that was so much better than what was going on previously. But then after a while, we realized that we did not have that intentionality at the forefront of why we picked that task and when we use that task. And then we always say, like, we left a lot of learning on the table because It was like the task was like a means to an end. It was like, okay, we found an answer and then we moved on. Like we didn't actually use the task and the student thinking to take their student strategies and then try to make connections and then essentially try to lead us to the next piece of the learning, right? To really elevate, to push that learning up. That for us is huge. And we coined that as fueling sense making. And that to us is such a big part of what we're trying to do with all the folks that we end up working with, either in live workshops or in our online academy. We really focus in on that fueling sense making. So like, let's get them in there. Like, let's get them engaged with like an amazing 3-act task by you, Graham, or by Dan, or by anybody else out there. And then once we've got them, then it's like they're just waiting and there's so much that we can do. So I love that you've focused in on that purposeful and intentional use of the task. I think that's so key. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about this or someone at home's thinking, they're going, yeah, I really think I should do this, but I'm not sure. I haven't used a 3-act task before. What would you say to teachers who say that like, I'm just really struggling? Like, where am I going to fit it into my teaching day? What do you say to someone who, you're just trying to help them get started and they're really struggling to figure out where it all fits?
So it's easy to say, like, look back in retrospect. And I would say now that I don't have time to not have the time to actually do one of these tasks, because just seeing like so many times we look at our learning objectives or we look at our content standards and we break it down into such a granular level that it seems like such a daunting task to where we can go ahead and tackle all of these things over the course of a year. So if you're not sure where you can fit one of these tasks in, maybe you're looking at the task from like a granular level. So if we come back to that formative and diagnostic assessment that we were just talking about there, Kyle, is what happens if you take this task and then you build the understanding from there, not at a granular level, but like at a 60,000 foot level. So you're looking at multiple standards because you're looking at estimation. You're looking at if your kids can place the number on the number line in their range. You're looking at computation. You're looking at justification. You're looking at reasoning. You're not looking at a granular thing that's just kind of a checklist. Like I'm doing this learning objective on day 2 of week 3 of month 4. And so you're looking at it more of like a comprehensive, because you're going to get far more from one task than what you'll ever get from one granular lesson on a day.
Right. And if you think the other way, you're going to get frustrated probably that you will never have enough time to teach all the standards. And how am I going to cover everything if I'm spending all this time in this one task on this one day? Yeah, I think that's huge, is to how do we ensure people like open up and look at it from that 60,000 foot view. Graham, you work with teachers all the time now. Like, how are you helping them see that 60,000 foot view?
For me, it's getting into classrooms, really. A lot of the times when we talk about PD, I think it's the working side by side with them as much as possible. So like if you're not comfortable about using one of these tasks, I think what makes it really powerful is when you go and see somebody teach one of these tasks first and you're like, whoa, I can do it. Because both of you have been working alongside teachers. I've been working alongside teachers. Or even if you don't have a coach in your building, ask your principal to come watch your class so you can go co-teach one of these lessons. Like you don't have to do it alone. I think a lot of the times, whether it's a workshop, it's coming back and it's that community piece. So how is it that when you do see a good idea, like a 3-act task and you want to try one, how is it that you can pair up with somebody and find that accountability partner? That for me is always going to be it. I'm not doing this alone. So when you see a good idea, when you go back to your district, how do you plan to put this into practice? And so just asking teachers to think thoughtfully about that before they walk out the door has really helped.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I really like the 60,000 foot idea, because when you really think about it, and you said it already, where we can look back, it's so easy when you think in hindsight that really at the end of the day, what is it that we want students to walk out of our classroom with? And when I ask teachers that, usually they come up with all of these other elements that we aren't focusing on. Like we tend to hyper focus on these little tiny pieces, these granular pieces and concepts like you've mentioned, or skills. And yet when we ask them what we really want for students, it's usually not those things. Like we're usually talking about things like being able to problem solve, being able to to be resilient and persevere, all of these pieces that you want students to think positively about math class. And yet we spend all of our time trying to make sure that every tiny little piece that we've quote unquote taught it. And then at the end of the day, when we actually think to how things are going now, like, when you say, so how's that going for you? I know for me, it was like, well, they're not really learning that stuff anyway. Like as much as I'm trying my best to do those things, a lot of students are walking away with none of those things, right? Or just little tiny pieces here and there. So I really like this idea of focusing in on really what are those big ideas that we want to take away and we want students to walk away from. And then how am I going to do this? Well, don't do it alone, right? So find somebody, whether it's online or whether it's someone in your building, just get vulnerable. I think without being vulnerable, you're not going to be able to do anything. Like you just have to be okay with saying, I just don't know. Like I've been doing this for years and this is the result I'm getting. And, some kids are getting it, but some kids aren't, like, can we work on this together? And like, let's see if maybe we can put our heads together. And typically, two heads are going to be way better than one. So it's a great message that you've shared. So that's huge. I'm wondering for those who are thinking, and there might be some at home going, yeah, I'm definitely going to do this. This is something I want to look into. Do you have any like favorite tasks that are sort of like really fresh in your mind right now that you're really liking? Like I know for me, I sort of get really excited about a certain task for a little while and I try to use it in different ways in different classrooms. And then, you find another and you sort of move on. Is there anything that's sort of like that for you right now? One that you're really excited when you have an opportunity to do it in a class or share it at a workshop?
The one that is a very good telltale task for me is there's two tasks. There's one with the light bulb and the Skittles inside there, and then the other one involves Skittles as well. For me, those are two really telling tasks because it asks students and teachers to kind of engage in quantity estimation. And it's amazing to see, it never kind of fails really, how much we don't use estimation in our classrooms. So it's kind of a little bit of a sucker punch task for teachers, but it's also a very good way to formatively assess how well students are estimating. Because like even for the listeners, like could you count on one hand how many times you had your kids engage in an estimation activity last year? So it's like as if we're not estimating. Estimation is not something you can be doing once every 2-3 months. Otherwise, you suck at it. And so what ends up happening is it's something that you need that repetitive practice. And I think that's where Andrew Stadell's Estimation 180 comes in really, really handy. So yeah, that estimation needs to be happening a lot for sure.
You got me a little bit curious here, Graham. Could you fill us in a little bit about this light bulb Skittles task? Walk us through, like we've talked about being intentional with the task. Like what are you aiming at for like a content standard? And then like how does that task kind of unfold?
I would use the task primarily with grade 1, grade 2 kids. And what I ended up doing is my wife actually was creating a teacher appreciation gift for our daughters a couple years ago. And inside, I guess Amazon has this craft light bulb. And so what she did was she was stuffing the Skittles, and she did 5 different layers of Skittles inside the light bulb. And so when we flip the light bulb over, you want to know how many Skittles are inside the light bulb. So kids are adding a set of numbers. Most of the time, teachers will estimate roughly about 45 to 50, and there's actually like 91 inside. So like it's almost half the quantity. And so it's just really, really telling. But then again, the numbers, that it comes back to that intentional and purposefulness, where the numbers, there's a lot of friendly numbers, there's double numbers. I think the numbers are like 19, 19, 17, 15, and 21. So there's a lot of opportunity for compatible numbers, doubles numbers, and then just seeing the strategies that students can come up with as they begin to combine those numbers.
Awesome. I've done that task with you actually at a workshop you did recently here in Windsor. And I feel like a long while ago, what I started noticing was I would do tasks ahead of time, kind of 5 practices, the anticipation, and I would do like legit estimates with the ThreeAct math tasks that I was trying. And what I always found with like quantity estimates, like your typical like guessing jar type estimates, was that I was always like ridiculously low. So I'm now in this habit of taking whatever my estimate is and I double it. And I did that with you. Like my table, I don't know, Graham, if you noticed, but at my table, they were like, you know this problem. I was like, I actually don't know this problem. I'm like, this is my strategy. I use like, okay, I figured this is how many were in the bottom. And then I was like, I think I'm looking. And I was sort of just making some sort of estimate based on what I could see spatially, because obviously it's not like a regular cylinder or anything like that. And I was like, I think it's this, but I know I'm way off, so I'm going to double it. Like, and that was it. And everyone was like, oh, boo. You know, they were all booing me at the table and everything like that. But that's like my go-to. And you nailed it. Estimation is something that we all as adults are not that great at. So just imagine our poor little ones who, you know, we're trying to help them think of reasonable answers, or at least to consider looking at their solution and try to figure out if it's reasonable. And yet we don't give them enough opportunity to actually make estimates to see whether that can actually be reasonable or not. So that to me was a shock. And, you know, something else that I'm reminded of, and I wanted to hit on it in this interview, was from that particular workshop. It was a whole day workshop, a great workshop. I learned a ton. Everyone there was really happy with how everything went and how much they learned. Something that I really wanted to touch on was the idea, and you spent a significant amount of time unpacking some of the number sense trajectory after a few of the different tasks you did that day. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit of the background, like what research were you basing some of that number sense trajectory off of? Like, do you have any particular resources that you could share here for those who are interested? Anyone who's, you know, in that pre-K to all the way into the later primary grades of counting in quantity, and just kind of share some of your background in there, because I thought that was really fascinating. A lot of teachers felt like they learned a ton from it.
Yeah, for me, my kind of go-to for all things mathematics for quite some time as I was a classroom teacher was leaning on the work of John Vanderwall for a lot of teaching student-centered mathematics. I used that book a lot, but then as I realized, whenever he was referencing PK2 students, he kept on referencing Doug Clements and Julie Saaremaa. So the number sense trajectory for our K2 students is really primarily based off the work of John Vanderwall, Doug Clements, Julie Saaremaa, and then also the Common Core standards that are here in the United States. And so just taking those and kind of just because I think the learning objectives, whether you're in Canada, wherever you are in the world, a lot of times they can get wordy and it can be really hard to be consumable for a teacher. So the goal was like to take a word like hierarchical inclusion and kind of like, let's make sense of it. Like, what does this mean? Because at the end of the day, when you're sitting down next to a kid trying to assess, if you don't know what you're looking for, you just don't know what you're looking for. And in that case, you can't move their thinking forward.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. And I mean, for me, not only do I need to make sense of words like hierarchical inclusion, I need to actually practice how to say them first, because that one was definitely a tongue twister for me. But, you know, I spent a lot of time as well. And, you know, I had a funny feeling Mr. Vanderwall would pop in. And I'm so happy that you shared Doug Clements and Julie Saaremaa. Their work is actually quite fascinating. And I had an opportunity to hear Doug speak at NCTM this past go around as well. And not only is he amazing with the early number piece and the whole trajectory there, but like he's also a really animated presenter. So anyone who's listening, if you have the opportunity to go see Doug, definitely do it. And then I also want to pitch Alex Lawson. You had mentioned, like, if you don't know what you're looking for, then how are you going to actually assess it? She's got a great resource, and she's based out of Ontario here, called What to Look For. So that's a great resource as well. And Graham, you may or may not have come across that one, but definitely one to look at. And for me, that John Vanderwall book is actually what my good friend Yvette Lehman and myself have really spent a lot of time digging into the chapter on proportional reasoning from John Vanderwall's book that you cited, Teaching Student-Centered Mathematics. And we have learned so much, and we've had to reread it like probably a good 50 times each, but we've learned so much from it, and it's helped us to unpack so many different concepts. So, you know, 3 really good resources there. So folks, make sure you check out John Vanderwall's work, Doug Clements and Julie Saaremaa, and Alex Lawson's What to Look For. Definitely something cool to check out for sure.
Graham, we're wrapping up here. It's almost been an hour already, and we are wondering, where our listeners could learn more about you and what kind of resources they could get their hands on from you. Like, I know so many teachers have taken advantage of your progression videos and your 3-act math tasks. You've been working with Christina Tonnevold on an online course on fractions. You want to share a little bit about where everyone can find that kind of stuff?
Yeah, for me, I guess the biggest space is really on my blog, where I kind of share a lot of things that come to my brain. My brain's been on overload here for the last little while, so it's not been where I've been able to share a whole bunch, but I've been kind of following along on Twitter. But things are going to start ramping up here again. There's a lot of, I'd probably say I have close to 20 tasks right now that I'm going to be putting together over the next couple months. They've just been kind of sitting in the crock pot, and it's time to get them out to make room for some new ideas. So yeah, everything that I have, anything that I create, I just kind of share in that space. And then, if we can ever connect with listeners at conferences, on my webpage there, it kind of says where I'm going to be. And I just love to kind of connect, get together, and, let's be math soulmates.
Right. So that's at gfletchy.com, and we'll put all that in show notes.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Graham. It's been a pleasure having you. Thanks for spending the time with us this evening. I know folks at home, the Math Moment Maker community, are thankful that you've taken this time, and I'm sure they are going to be looking you up on your blog, on Twitter at gfletchy, and I'm sure they're going to be reaching out to see if you are the math soulmate for them.
Nice.
Have a great night,
Take
my
care.
friend. We'll talk to you soon.
Appreciate it. Thank you, boys. All the best. Take care.
We want to thank Graham again for spending some time with us to share his perspective on math education with us and you, the Math Moment Maker community.
Again, we want to let you know that the Make Math Moments Academy, your home for ongoing support in implementing problem-based lessons, amping up your pedagogical moves, and stretching your math content knowledge, is open. And the Make Math Moments Academy community is waiting for you to get in here.
You can decide if the Academy is the right fit for you at makemathmoments.com/academy.
That's makemathmoments.com/academy.
In order to ensure you don't miss out on the new episodes that we release every Monday morning, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you like what you're hearing, please share the podcast with a colleague and help us reach an even wider audience by leaving us a review on iTunes, just like Sean Hershey did in this particular episode at the beginning, and by tweeting us at MakeMathMoments on Twitter.
Show notes and links to resources from this episode can be found at makemathmoments.com/episode 45. Again, that's makemathmoments.com/episode 45.
Well, until next time, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high fives for you.